Hi guys, Garage RC here, back on another video. Before we start today's video, please, if you like the work that I do and like the content that I produce, can you subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bells and leave a like for the video. Okay guys, I'm going to get straight into it today. Today is my top tips for basically assembling and running an XRX. This video is kind of impromptu. I've had a lot of requests and asked for tips on how to build this car. And you know, having built quite a few of many mini RC cars now, you kind of forget that some people are coming from the point of view that their last car was a Mini Z, and now they're going to be assembling their first kit RC car. So let's start off from the top. Before you even approach the chassis itself, which is partly built, so this is actually an easy one to do as a first build. The first thing you should always do is assemble the electronics and test them. And the reason for that, I'm going to take my XRX out of its body shell, is because often the servo itself may not be calibrated to the center where you think it is. So if you put it in first, so by the servo we mean the device that controls the steering here, if you're uninitiated to the Mini RC kits and I've only used a Mini Z previously, the servo is this bit here that controls the steering. You can see there's a white arm that turns the steering left and right. Well, when you put that arm on the servo, if the servo isn't centered, say for example the servo is facing down almost, and then you turn your car on for the first time, that will lock the servo into a position it's not supposed to be in, maybe even against the metal chassis here, and break the servo. So instantly you've ruined your car before you even got started. Obviously the servo is replaceable, but you don't want to be doing that. So assemble your electronics outside of the car, test that everything works. I'll go into more detail on how to assemble the electronics and what we do later on in the video, or it might even be in a part 2 if this video goes on for too long. I'm going to try and keep this brief, but yes, assemble your electronics first, test them, make sure they work and that the servo is centered before you move on to assembling them inside the car. Okay, so another tip that I like to do is I like to have easy access to my servo while I'm setting up the steering. So let's just say you've assembled your steering and everything has been put together as per the instructions. And one thing worth mentioning is I think these arms are told to be 28 millimeters. I think that's a misprint in the instructions. I think it's meant to be more like 18 millimeters. I think Mr. Beaver pointed out that to me, but you tend to adjust these anyway when you're building a car like this. So whatever it says in the manual, you end up doing your own measurements. Just keep it roughly equal each side to get your wheels to where you want to be. Now, I've said this before, roughly parallel, so when you're steering to the maximum you get a nice parallel wheel position, which will help with your drifting. But back to the servo. So I tend not to. If you can see, there's a screw here. Let me just get something to point with. I've lost my pointer. There's a screw here that holds the servo horn on. Now when I was assembling this car, I left the screw off initially and I left this mount off as well. I only put the one mount on, and that enabled me to be able to slide the servo into position, check the arm position, see if when the servo is switched on, the wheels are centered, that they're not off like that. And then that enabled me to move the servo in and out of position, pop the arm on and off until I was happy. Then I put this screw in and then I bolted the servo in. That will save you a lot of time. Once you've got everything in with the side mounts here on both sides, and then you realize your steering's a bit off center, it takes a lot more work then to unscrew things and get the servo out. So I tend to do that first. So if I was going to do this in sequence, I would assemble the chassis, not put the electronics in, get everything ready, get the servo centered, then glue all your electronics into position. I would almost not bother with the gyro while I'm doing that. I would actually just have the servo plugged directly into the receiver, so that, sorry, mine isn't even plugged in, my gyro. Hang on 1 second. I was testing a servo on this board. Okay. So that's my next tip. Another tip during the build, as you might see here, I've only used one motor screw to hold the motor on. I haven't used a second one, which would be behind this gear. Why have I done that? Well, I've done this before with my BZ3. I found one screw sufficient, easier to adjust if the pinion's too tight against the spur, and it means I haven't got to take this off to take the motor on and off. So I use one screw there, and that works just fine. There's not that much torque going through these little mini RC, and this is rear wheel drive. Another tip, especially if you're a newbie, is make sure the wheels can turn, the spur can turn easily. If you've got this too tight against the spur, that's going to affect how smoothly your car runs. So make sure it's got plenty of free play. So you can see there my wheels are moving quite easily. So when you're following the instructions, it's going to ask you to assemble various parts to get the steering mechanism and the rear wishbones joined onto the car. One of the things I'll point out right from the start is you'll see that these are set quite wide. Now at this width, there aren't many cars that are actually going to fit in the 94mm range. You're going to find yourself screwing these all the way in. So if you look at mine, this is set up for my Subaru, and I'm going to zoom in on this to show you, I have actually removed a little bit of plastic off my arms so that when I tighten them all the way in, they're about 51mm. Okay, now why is this important? Well, I'm using a Subaru shell, which is actually quite wide. And comes with offset 2.5 wheels. Now these wheels I've trimmed on the inside, but if I was going to use a Subaru shell, I'd probably use an offset 1 or an offset 0 to minimize how much work I have to do on those arms. This is a wide shell. If I compare this, say, the Nissan GTR, I'm going to show you here. Sorry, let's zoom back out. Okay. Right, you can see my Subaru shell is wider. So if you're going to use this car, you'd have to use 0 offset wheels and maybe even adjust the plastic. So just bear that in mind when you're setting up. But my tip actually would be to leave it as a wide setup, because it's far easier to learn how to drift a rear wheel drive in a wide setup. That means maybe not putting your shell on straight away. Obviously, if you're going to do that in a safe place where you're not going to bash the front of your car against something and break it. So the next tip I'm going to mention, although I haven't done it here, is I've got a connector joining the speed controller to the motor. Now I happen to have a Molex connector lying around. These are hard to get hold of, but I prefer usually to solder my wires directly to the motor. Now these wires may not be long enough, so it's a good idea to have some spare wire that you can use. Again, you can get that off eBay. I think that's 22 AWG I'm using. I use quite flexible wire, so it doesn't actually impinge. The wires that often come with these controls are a bit stiff. I like the flexible wires because it doesn't get in the way, doesn't put too much stress on the solder joints, and when you put your body shell on, it tucks down nicely. My next tip is to do with the caster adjustment. Caster adjustment is the position of these arms relative to the lower arms, and you can see there's some movement in these arms at the moment here. Okay, so in the kit there are washers available that you can put either behind or in front of the arm to decide where you want to position the arm. So as you can see on my car here, I'm going to zoom in again to show you. There's some little black washers here. So I've set my caster adjustment back. So that's something you can do or not do. It's not going to make a huge difference for your beginner. You don't have to do that, but it's once you've got your car set up, it will give it better drift control if you've got that set up. My next tip is the suspension setup. Now I'm going to go to the front shocks for this to show you. As you can see, I've got mine quite soft. You can see I've got this right to the top, and I find for hard surfaces that soft suspension just works better for drifting. Now that might not be the same for everybody, but that's what works for me. try and adjust your down stop so your wheels are fairly level. On the rear, I tend to keep my wheels fairly flat. Now, another tip I will point out, I don't know if I can see this on here. Okay, so when I assembled my car, I also found that the drive shafts here looked like they weren't going to seat in at all. By the time I'd adjusted the top arms and got the wheel positions where I wanted them, they seem to be just right. Now, they don't look like they're going very far in, but that actually works pretty well. You don't need, you can see that there. Now, if you did want to adjust it some more, you can put some washers inside here to bring that in. Again, there are some in the kit that you can use. Now, this kit I've got in front of me, this is not an issue, but I did have this issue on mine. So just in case you guys do, if you see here on the body mount screws, these holes are here for the metal body mounts. My kit didn't have that hole. I had to use a hobby drill to make that hole. So that's the only thing I had to do, but no one else has mentioned that to me, but I just thought I'd mention that just in case. I think it's an oversight on that particular model. Maybe it hadn't been machined. But I had to make those holes manually so that the screws that hold these mounts on could be placed. So the next tip applies to if you do want to have use of a wider offset, you're probably better off going to a 98mm body. Now for that you'll need one of the adjustable chassis. So I've got one here. These are the new carbon ones. They used to be the metal ones, which are heavier, but these are the newer ones. With that you can make your chassis 98mm. So if you're intending on doing that anyway, there's no point assembling the car. You might as well get the chassis first and change it over before you put everything else on. Why would you want to go to a 98mm chassis for this car? Well, it means then you can make full use of the wide stance of this car. So for example, my Subaru width is about 71mm there, but let's just say I went to a 98mm chassis and wanted to use this AMG body. You'll see that straight away. Let's turn it upside down so you can see. I'll get this right at some point, bear with me. .77, 78mm almost, okay. Much wider body. That'll give you a much more stable drifting car. So especially if you're a newbie, that would be a benefit to you. You'd be able to drift the car more easy. Now I am going to do another video where I convert mine to 98mm, but I'm just trying to get as many tips as I can out there, and I'll go into more detail when I do the reconstruction with the 98mm chassis into individual things that you might want to look at. So those are just a few tips that I wanted to point out. Oh, actually one more thing. You may notice I've got some white dust on these rear arms, so my wheels are rubbing on the arms, and you may need to sand the arms. So these are zero offset wheels and they're just rubbing ever so slightly. So I did actually do a little bit of sanding with a bit of sanding paper, and that seemed to do the job. Again, if you go 98mm, you're not going to have that issue because you can have offset 2, offset maybe even 3, offset 2 at the front, and that should be fine. Okay guys, so that's just a quick overview of some tips for building this car. If you guys have any other tips that you want to add, please leave a comment below. I'll do a separate video going into the detail of setting up the electronics and hopefully get that up pretty quickly as well. These speed controls are exactly the same as the GR Racing ones and the Atomic Racing speed controls, and the exact way you set them up is similar. So you can look on the GR Racing website under their support section. If you go into the GLA version 2 build, they've got a whole section about programming the speed controller, and that's exactly the same as this one. It's the same process. The only other thing you may have to do is when you assemble your electronics, sometimes the motor may not run in the direction you want and you have to change the wire position on the motor. I think if you're going to get one of these cars, you've got to get used to using a soldering iron. There's going to be some time or another where you need it, no matter how much you try and avoid it. And get used to the fact that there's a lot of adjustment required. I mean, this race is actually pretty easy, but when I got my first rear-wheel drive drifter was a DRZ version 1, it took a lot of adjusting before the setup was correct. So just bear that in mind. It is challenging. They are challenging. I know there'll be some of the enthusiasts out there that say, oh no, they're very easy. I don't think they are. I think they're quite challenging to set up, as opposed to an all-wheel drive, which generally runs pretty well out of the box after you've assembled it, like the GLA. So guys, that's all for today. I hope those tips were useful if you're building your XRX. If you want any more advice, just drop me a line. I'm more than happy to help you out. And leave a comment if you want me to do a video about anything else to do with the XRX build. I will do one about how to drift a rear-wheel drive Mini RC, and I'll probably bring that to you after I've done the electronics video. So guys, I hope that video was useful. If you like what I do, subscribe to the channel. All your subs count, and I'll see you all next time.